I want to start off by saying that I want to talk about the politics of discussing or theorizing race in my doctorate program. And this paper is actually a paper in progress. I just decided to write it within the last couple of weeks because I had heard from other individuals, students of color in other programs, who've been traumatized by their white faculty members. And I realized that my experience, I actually had something to say about my experience in terms of pursuing my PhD here at University of Southern California in the School of Policy, Planning, and Development. And I basically was actually tired of hearing about the way in which white faculty members, and I will clarify in terms of which specific group of white faculty members have been engaging in what I call psychological terror, in terms of projecting their own inability to come to terms or grips with what happens when the other sits across from them and is theorizing about their identity as white people. That there's an emotional response that takes place. You have the emotional reaction, then you have a realization that you had an emotional reaction from a particular person's scholarship that happens to be a person of color. And then because you're embarrassed that you had this emotional reaction, you must then figure out a way to justify this emotional reaction. And the way in which this justification plays out is that you then must attack the individual and say that they did something, engaged in some type of activity that caused you to react emotionally. And so this is sort of the crux of my paper. The politics of writing about or even deciding to come to publicly disclose and talk about this issue that is known among students of color, because we all talk about it amongst ourselves. And we talk about it with progressive white faculty members who are able to understand the way in which, quote unquote, whiteness as a system of domination is constructed in this country. But we're unable to bring it to the foray, like, say, the presentation that was just presented, and bring it forth to our faculty, our administration, and to the president, because it's a little bit different than looking at outcomes in sort of math performance. We're talking about something else. And the process and the procedures that are used to supposedly address this issue, it requires something else. That is, the way in which my department tried to get me to address this issue, that is filing a grievance or filing a claim of discrimination based on race against my faculty when I'm the only black student in the doctorate program, is not appropriate. I'm talking about climate, I'm talking about the way in which whiteness harms and destroys students of color. It requires something else. It requires a public discussion about what is going on, what's the climate that's going on, what are the sort of symbolic practices, what I call systems of interaction or communication patterns that are enacted out. I'm going to start by some quotes. If you listen to these quotes, if you were an outsider and didn't know who I was, you would think that I was the most radical, angry black woman that ever stepped up onto the campus of the University of Southern California. And I would give a little disclosure and say, first of all, I am that integrated generation. From age 6 until age 37, I've been in all white educational institutions because I got bused with the all West Side school. So I'm very familiar with the norms, patterns, values, the way in which whites sanction and terrorize students of color, particularly black students, because there's something specific about the relationship between white and black relations in the U.S. So I'm very familiar, I'm bicultural. So I am not, quote unquote, this sort of black student who's not had much interaction with whites. My entire life and interactions have been in white environments. That's the first thing I want to put out there. The second thing is that my area of research is that I'm trained as an international comparativist. I do basically international comparative development in developing countries, specifically looking at sub-Saharan countries. But I'm trained to look at Asia, Latin America, the U.S., the role of sort of civil society in public policy and foreign policy formulation. So not only, quote unquote, have I been socialized in all white environments, I've actually studied, traveled, and worked extensively throughout Africa and been to Europe. So I've also had introductions to other cultures and interact with other groups of people. So once again, let's break the stereotype. Because the sort of discourse is that black students who've not had much interaction with whites, have problems adjusting in all white environments. Well, I am that integrated generation, so I just want to put that on the table. Let me start with some quotes. You called me a racist and crazy. Stop engaging in rhetorical polemics. This is not scholarship. It's unacceptable to raise your voice at me. Mentioning a gun in such a context, whether or not intended as a threat, can be construed as such. If I am going to continue to work with you, I need to be able to comment upon your work without evoking hostility. This is my dissertation advisor. It's distracting to discuss race and gender in your dissertation. This was a response by a white, gay, Jewish male committee member. Only my people were enslaved, the Jews. You think you're African? There is little point being an advisor if the advice is unacceptable. Another white Jewish committee member, former chair of my dissertation. And the reason why I am disclosing these quotes is because they were very damaging, beyond damaging. There was a psychological, there was an emotional, and there was a physical response to having to hear these types of attacks against my character. When I had known these people from anywhere from 2 to 6 years, these were not just random white people walking on the street. These were individuals who either I have house sat for, who either I have picked up their medication and delivered it to them, or attended their gay fundraising events. So these were individuals that I had personal relationships with that I had built over my doctorate tenure. The way this paper is evolving is that the first section sort of talks about the way in which liberal whites, and the reason why I'm focusing on liberal whites is because I understand where I sit with conservative whites, that they're very clear about wanting to protect their white privilege and status in this society. And they also are not the ones who are trying to, quote unquote, espouse this liberal and colorblind society to some extent. They're not trying to reach out, quote unquote, and embrace other people of color, particularly African Americans. And I'm also not talking about progressive or radical whites, because I also have relationships with them. I understand where I stand with them in sort of their political ideological positioning. But I do have an issue, or the focus of the individuals that I am focusing on are with liberal whites, those who specifically espouse a liberal and colorblind philosophy. That is, we believe in racial equality, that all of us are equal under the law. But there's no discussion about the way in which their whiteness, their identity in which it's constructed on a system of domination and subordination of people of color, and specifically blacks. The reason why I focus on black graduate students is that I can't speak for Latinos, I can't speak for Asians. And I think there's something distinctly different about the way whites respond and react to black people in American society. And the reason why I say that is their identity was forged in opposition to blackness, the negation of blackness in this country. And yes, you have intermediate racial groups. There's a whole discourse around we need to move beyond black and white. And I understand that we need to sort of look at the way in which other social groups have been racialized in opposition to whites, in opposition to each other, and in opposition to blacks. But what I'd like to sort of quickly point out is, in this sort of, however you call it, racial social structure, matrix, blacks, whites, and whatever else is in between, these people can move around. They may be valorized at particular points in time. They may be ostracized. But blacks, structurally, we remain at the bottom of this racial structure. And so I don't have the luxury, and I don't have the option, and I don't have the opportunity to sort of shift my identity and to move around in this matrix that everyone's talking about. I understand that my position as a black graduate student is linked to my sort of greater relationship to blacks in the society. In other words, even though I focus on what's happening to me as a black graduate student, I distinctly understand that this is part of a larger struggle of blacks engaged in the continuing of our liberation struggle in the United States for human rights in this country. I always say that I need to say this because in the sort of politics of deciding to talk about this, the responses have been very interesting as I engaged my white colleagues who said, Jill, you really need to go out and interview more students of color. See, because white folk, they're going to attack you. And they're going to try to say that you're crazy or that you're angry because of whatever. In the politics of getting this abstract out sent through my school, that I sent it to a particular faculty member, there had to be a public disclaimer and just distancing from me by saying, I don't know this student, I don't know this student twice, I don't know who she worked with, I don't know what her experiences were. So what is it about whiteness that it scares people that we can't even have this conversation? We can't even have a conversation without people telling me, oh my God, there's going to be such a backlash. I start out by saying that my intent is not to vilify, demonize, or cast aspersion on my white faculty, even though I wasn't accorded the same level of respect in the way in which they vilified, demonized, and criminalized me in simply trying to complete a dissertation that looked at the way a constituency building initiative evolved in the United States. That is, what is the way racial structuring in the United States shapes our identities and why we have particular political positions and who we decide to build strategic allegiances with, specifically in the African constituency arena. Once again, I'm looking at Africa. I'm dealing with the way in which white identity was, as a social group, was constructed in juxtaposition to the way in which blacks as a racial identity was constructed, but at the same time breaking apart these sort of racial social categories. There are black ethnic groups and transnational groups that reside here in the U.S., African immigrants, which is one of the groups that I look at. So here I am trying to do this sort of theorizing about race. It was not, or I have never said, which is very interesting because it came back to me by all my white faculty, this sort of gut-level emotional response: you called me a racist. You called me a racist. But these are individuals that I've been working with for a very long time who internalized my dissertation research. They read something that fundamentally challenged their self-concept, because the way they see themselves as white liberals is that everyone is equal under the law. But when they had to read about the way in which whiteness was constructed in the United States in terms of a system of domination, it fundamentally affected or destabilized their self-concept. And they had emotional reaction. There's nothing wrong with having an emotional reaction to something that you read. Matter of fact, we're human. What I believe is wrong and was an injustice is the way in which they then had to not acknowledge their emotional reaction, but attack me by castigating me, making comments about my character, or, quote unquote, threatening them. And as another white faculty colleague of mine said to me, Jill, you did threaten them. No, it wasn't in the way of, threatening them with a gun, but you threatened their identity, their self-concept, the way in which they see themselves. I want to provide sort of 3 examples that sort of illustrate this pattern of behavior. That because there's an inability to acknowledge that we're human beings, that we actually can be affected by various types of scholarship, and that we must hide behind this sort of veneer of distancing between sort of intellect and emotions, and what I call calling on the collective memory of whiteness. But there's a couple of what I call narratives going on. My chair and my other faculty members called on a collective memory of whiteness. Here's a black student who's threatened me. I must subordinate her. I must put her in her place. Well, if you look at the way in which whites historically put blacks in their place, and that's why I said reflections of a modern day lynching, is that they used terroristic tactics. They either physically lynched us, so there's a physical component, but also it's a representation of instilling fear. That if other people see how this individual is being treated because she, quote unquote, engaged in a certain type of activity that we do not want, we will instill in fear in other individuals who want to do this type of research. So what I believe was going on in their mind, whether they realize it or not, is sort of conscious, this sort of unconscious memory that gets played out onto me. I become the violent, emotional, out of control black student, even though in fact my faculty members were the ones who were emotionally out of control. When I tried to assert a sense of agency and explain to them, I need to remove myself from white environments because this is not the only incidence of where whites faculty members have in fact attacked me. That I've seen a consistent pattern. I was a faculty fellow at Virginia Tech that I will write about. I was a faculty fellow at Virginia Tech and elicited the same response from my scholarship. Prior to reading my scholarship, Jill was this exceptional black individual. Oh my God, she skydived, she rock climbed, she could interact with like different groups of people, but as soon as they read my scholarship, there was an emotional visceral attack, there was an emotional response, then there was a very, very vicious attack. Thank you, okay. I'm going to speed through this because actually I just want to get to the end. In terms, the way in which sort of the administration, that is the dean's response, I critique that the current mechanisms to deal with this particular issue, and that is the way in which I think these environments, all white environments, that have sort of systematic patterns of interaction that harm students of color, that to simply tell me that I should file a grievance being the only black graduate student in a program against my all-white faculty, or file a racial complaint against them, doesn't get at the issue. Not only that, it creates an adversarial relationship and completely destroys my professional reputation. For anybody knows, you need a letter of recommendation from these individuals. Okay? So that process, so that mechanism is not working. The dean, I'm just going to leave it at that the current mechanism doesn't work. And I have recommendations in terms of what I think needs to be put in place in order to address what's going on. In terms of my recommendations, I think there needs to be a discussion about ethics and integrity, and what does it mean to engage with a diverse student body, and what happens when you internalize the scholarship of this other that you think that you, quote unquote, can interact with, but really can't, because all of your day-to-day interactions are with white people. That you've never really had to engage with people of color in a substantive manner. That you never really had to come to our communities and sit there and listen the way in which we construct issues and deal with it and deal with your identity. You don't have to do that. My recommendations entail sort of this ethical discussion in terms of what the university needs to do. In terms of black students and students of color, my recommendation is that we create a national virtual website, a clearinghouse, a watchdog, and we identify the universities and the particular schools that basically engage in anti-black behavior against students of color. And once I investigate the legalities, we list the type of activity that's going on and the names of individuals, if that is legal. But at the same time, we need to, as a group, begin to put information out there to assist us about how do we select universities. Are these universities really living up to their standard about creating, quote unquote, a multicultural environment for everyone? I'm just going to end that. I wanted to respond to Dr. Lewis's question. I think that because I'm still formulating this, I think that what is going on in the School of my school, Policy Planning and Development, and also I think other departments, is that the individuals who are in positions of power come from a homogeneous group. And that the individuals who could actually help point out, because there's a blind spot. I found myself educating my chair about her identity as a white woman in position, in similarities to me, same, we both have PhDs. I actually come from a different class background than hers, but there's something about the nature of her being white that positions her differently than to me, regardless of our equal attainment education. And so I think that the people who could facilitate those kinds of conversations aren't in our school. They're not tenured. We need tenured faculty of color who are not scared at the repercussions of not getting tenure, basically. And we don't have a critical mass of native-born, because I make a distinction between sort of the other thing I think that's going on in my particular school in terms of pitting international faculty of color against native-born students and faculty of color. That's another dynamic. And so the people who are there who can facilitate these conversations aren't there. So, one suggestion that I found out attending this conference in New York was that at Harvard, Lonnie Grenier brought in, they were having some problems around the same type of issues, brought in a team of consultants. The faculty were resistant, but over a year process, I think it was a year, they began to sort of have this dialogue and conversation about, in this particular instance, I think the way in which white privilege acts out in our school and harms students of color. I think you have to have committed leadership, and that's a question I don't know if my school has. I'm just going to say all the variables I think that you need committed leadership. I think you also have to have white individuals who understand, and there are some there who do understand because I've had conversations with them, because I've had relationships with them, but who are willing to participate and act as sort of a facilitator for those other whites, because that's a reality, who are resistant. Folk of color can't do that because another dynamic rises up, like what I experienced in terms of individuals who said that I was their equal and their colleague flipped on me, and all of a sudden played this dominant subordinate role with me. So those are just my thoughts about, what do people do with this information? The dean knows what's going on. He knows what happened. What are they doing? I don't know, because I've not been contacted.
But there's also, I think there's, as you said, we've had these conversations, I think there are a lot of dynamics going on. I think being in a PhD program, it's a very unequal power relationship. These people have all the power. And there are a whole range of prejudices, I think, race, class, ethnicity. I mean, I experienced prejudice because I was Irish. And so I think and all of these things kind of come together. But I think our problem is the fact that there is no mechanism there for people to, that we can bring complaints and get some kind of justice or whatever at the end of the day. And this is because this is the type of institution we're in. And I don't know what we do about it.
I think another issue, I'm in SPPD too, I'm working on my dissertation now, and hoping not to have to tonight your class. But your title scared me. It did get an emotional response because I'm working on my dissertation. But I think one thing, I don't know if this is true in all departments, but particularly in SPPD, is that people are empiricists. And when you talk about people are going to think I'm crazy because I do this research, I think part of the problem is that you're telling your personal story, which we all learn in 695 from Terry Cooper, is we need to question our assumptions and we need to be empiricists and question where our values come into our research. So I think it is important for you to talk to other graduate students for the sake of differentiating what is a terrible dissertation process just because the process sucks and what is because of the stuff that you're talking about. Because I don't think a conversation in SPPD would start because of anybody's personal experience so much as because of empirical work, because that's the kind of school that it is.
See, I think that's kind of one of the problems, the lack of reflectiveness. And I think that just building kind of on what you were saying, the success that we did experience in the diversity scorecard were members who were willing to be self-reflective as individuals, who were willing to be reflective, what we call practitioners of care, meaning looking at themselves not only as individuals but in their professional capacities. And then some teams were reflective, and those were the people that were willing to, put everything on the table. So really what Jill was talking about, kind of some of the points I talked about, we can't accomplish equity, social justice, access, diversity, etc., unless there's a definite commitment and measure of self-reflection and professional reflection. And I think these dialogues aren't going to occur successfully if there isn't that reflective turn.
I have a question for you, Jill. I noticed when you were mentioning those 3 quotes that you listed, you identified 2 of the people as male Jewish white faculty members, yet when you mentioned the white woman, you did not mention her religion. So I'm wondering why you chose to single out the people as Jewish when you didn't refer to her as a white Muslim or Christian woman.
I think this particular person identifies herself as agnostic or atheist. And the reason why I highlighted a couple things, sexuality, gay, and the religion, is because they brought that into my conversation with me in terms of only my people have been enslaved. In response to what I had written about, the way in which my identity has been constructed as a black American was through enslavement. But his emotional response of me even talking about my enslavement was to negate it. And then also to negate that, that perhaps I may identify as African or I may not. But at the same point, his position as a white, because I'm focusing on, regardless of his marginalized Jewish identity, religious identity, he's white. There's a certain level of privilege, dominant groups in terms of defining your identity. So I could not turn around and say to him, well, in actuality, Ashkenazic Jews didn't adopt the Jewish religion until the 13th century, something like that. I couldn't turn around and say that because I'd be labeled anti-Semitic. But could I turn around and say to him that he's anti-black because of his attempt to negate my identity? In terms of the same thing with the other sort of gay Jewish male. Once again, read the dissertation proposal and immediate response. It's distracting to talk about race and gender in terms of salience of race and gender as analytical variables to understand sort of political organizing or foreign policy outcomes. And quickly, when I tried to sort of say, well, these variables are very important, quickly wanted to admonish me and say, well, blacks and Jews are supposed to be friends. You know, why are you basically challenging me, my authority, once again, as a white male, but also wanted to sort of say that our types of oppression are similar, because blacks and Jews have experienced different types of oppression and had different types of opportunity structures to sort of get around our oppression. They don't want to. There's no sort of sense of reflection, of sort of looking at it. You know, you're talking to a black woman, and what you're saying, the way my collective memory, that's the other part that in my paper is, the collective memory that I pull from is a collective memory of domination and subordination by whites, and it's carried out in certain sort of patterns of interaction, communication. I don't think that these male faculty members would come at me as aggressively as they did if I were a black male. And I don't think that my white female chair would have started crying every time I sat in her office, hysterically crying, which is a particular stereotypical role of the hysterical white woman in our history, saying that a black man or a black woman has acted in an impropriety way, and of course all the whites rally around her because this dangerous black woman has made her cry. She's crying hysterically. So all of these to me are codes. There's a at least the people that I talk to, we talk about the code of interaction between blacks and whites, and that's sort of why I specifically sort of highlighted that.
Yes, this is Humphries. I'm a first-year grad student, and I think the majority of my topics, the paper reports or whatever, been about race and whatever. And eventually, I want to go for my PhD sooner or later. But I guess my question is, if I encounter, say, resistance from the faculty or whatever for, like, I guess my dissertation or whatever. So, are you saying get maybe a network of people or a network behind me, or that's for me, or go to the dean? I wasn't sure what the way that I could fight against maybe them being against you or whatever.
You know, I don't even look at it. I'm just going to be very clear. I don't even look at it as they're against me.
Okay.
My way of understanding sort of these episodes is that I'm dealing with individuals who have not been reflective about their own prejudices, but they've constructed a certain identity of who they think they are. When they encounter, when there's a contradiction to that, they act or respond a certain way. And so I think, you know, it's hard because, you know, it depends, I think, on the nature of your department. Like if you're doing this in sociology, I don't know what department you're in. Sociology is standard sociological literature that I drew from. So I don't think you would have perhaps that same resistance, because I'm thinking that the individuals you're dealing with are familiar with that body of literature. I would say that after having this experience as a person of color, I would never enter into an institution that does not have a critical mass of faculty of color. I'm not saying that faculty of color, just because they're there, are going to support you, but at least I have options, choices. SPUD, there are no choices. There are no options. Those are sort of things I would look at. I would say build relationships with people in other departments who could perhaps be on your committee, who could interact with your chair if you run into problems. I will say that I had faculty of color, female faculty of color, on my committee, and one of them is like a premier scholar in race. But it was very interesting the position she took in terms of not wanting to actually engage my chair, my white chair. When I think, to be very honest with you, when I look at reflection, because I told her about what was going on, if she was willing to play her role as an outside committee member and actually done some facilitation, I think it really would have helped my chair, not personalized, because she thought I was attacking her. As she said, you called me a racist, and then I realized, oh, okay, you weren't. But, you know, after the fact, all this other stuff. So, you know, if you have someone who really takes their role as an outside committee member seriously, that's the issue about ethics and teaching that I am trying to develop, is that, you know, we really need to talk about teaching ethics to doctorate students. We don't teach ethics. At least, okay, we taught in SPUD, we teach ethics generally with premier ethicists, but in teaching and engaging with students, we don't have that kind of discourse.
I think it's not it's not simply in the realm of graduate study or the professoriate. I have been a TA for undergraduate classes trying to talk about Peggy McIntosh's article on the invisible knapsack, right, with white privilege. And what I received was not necessarily just resistance, but blankness, a complete blankness, because there was no common ground to come to. Students who are at an age where they say, but that's in the past, and have no concept of the need to sort of examine layers and levels that may not be so overtly, in their consciousness or in their popular culture day to day. And so I found that to be a struggle with people at a certain age, and in turn, these are students who are matriculating through this educational system and emerging. So it's not something like that.
I have a question for you. Like academics, in order to build a career in academia, you sometimes have to take a particular stand, a particular viewpoint. You become famous for a certain idea that you have, and sticking to your guns in that way. How much do you think that maybe played a role in the reaction that you got? And do you think it's localized to your particular discipline, like social sciences, as opposed to engineering or what have you?
So if I understand your question, you're asking to what extent me basically arguing my position, whatever that might be in my dissertation, elicited a response, type of response from my faculty.
Well, how much do you think their conditioning in terms of being, advocating their point and their ideas?
Yeah, I'm glad you actually brought this.
Of academia as a whole is to advocate your points and your ideas and try to convince everybody that you're right in some way.
Yeah, that actually came up because it's very interesting, and I'll focus on my chair because that's where it came up the most. Her position was class trumps race, because she comes from a working class immigrant background. My position was there are intersections between class, race, gender, and sexual orientation, and that I wanted to use a more complex framework to talk about what was going on, at least what I perceived was going on in what I was studying, the phenomena I was studying. And she was stuck on class. Couldn't even get past sort of, there's a more complex dynamic going on, just class. Race is just completely, would not even deal with it. So, yeah, I mean, we all come in, I think, with our particular biases and positions, but I think it's important as, those of us in training who want to teach, that we're open, that we validate other perspectives. I'm in PA, public administration, which is an extremely conservative field. They don't use the theoretical frameworks that I borrowed from sociology and critical race theory or from law. And I'm trying to sort of actually say, we need to begin to think about race in a different way in our field, in our particular field. And there was a lot of, that was the resistance I ran into where I was doing sort of my faculty fellowship, because they were just completely resistant to sort of integrating and cross-fertilization.
Do you think that's localized to your particular discipline, or do you think that's something that you find across?
I don't know. You'd have to ask someone else.
It's not.
Oh, okay.
I would say it's not.
It's not. It's not.
It's not.
And then I can't speak for Jill's research, but I can speak for having gone through our department as a pregnant student, and it's just a different experience, and it's not. Bottom line.
Right. In a department like anthropology that reports itself. Irony comes to mind. We need to wrap up, but I wanted to just sort of maybe get a last statement from everyone. This is an interdisciplinary conference, and I think that what we're hearing is that actually these projects that come from very different backgrounds and very different methodologies and very different approaches to problem solving are contributing pretty mightily to the different kinds of research that we can, correlate, that we can bring together. And I wonder if anyone had any last comments on interdisciplinary work in this area, in education very specifically.